So I think we started this off talking about the Time's Up movement, the Time's Up, Me Too, and all the movements, but I think what we don't do often enough is actually look at where we are. And I want everybody to look at this stage. This is 2 CEOs and a senior managing director. Women of color, women in power positions right now. It wasn't the Me Too movement that brought them there or the Time's Up. They are there now because of working their way there. So I think what I'd like to kind of start the conversation off with is, how do we take what now is this moment, they call it a moment for women. How do we take it from being a moment to a movement to change? Because you women got where you were going without parades, without walking in the street, without entertainment news talking. So when you look at it now with the movement that's going on, what do you guys think is going to be the thing that makes this permanent and not just a news cycle? Who wants to jump in first?
Since I'm so clearly the oldest, I'll go, and I have the biggest perspective, the longest perspective, not biggest, longest perspective. Let me start just a little bit of a tackle, because I think the important thing is to think through what we're asking for and what the objective is, right? So we've certainly, since I was practicing, I started my career as a prosecutor, federal and state. So if you want to talk about environment not particularly warm and fuzzy to women or people of color, where some of the things that we're talking about in the Me Too movement were kind of regular and de jour, and you had to just survive to be able to be successful. The good news is that I was also in an environment that, wow, incredibly sexist, also was based on merit. And so I was able to exceed because I was very good at what I did. So that's a good thing. And there's a lot more women in those roles. I was in 1991, the first woman and person of color to ever be the number 2 in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, right? So which is a big deal because it was an all-male, all not very colorful place. Now we have an African-American woman state's attorney, right? Right. So but here's the issue, and here's why it's really important. She's one of just a very few in the country, right? One of very few women of color leading a prosecutor's office in the country. Here in Illinois, in the United States Attorney's Office, which is huge, we have never had a woman or a person of color United States Attorney, ever. In the history, you walk in that office, it's just a wall of men, white men. So that's outrageous and offensive. And so we have broken through a lot of barriers. There's one African-American woman CEO in the Fortune 2000. So I say all that to say we've accomplished a lot, but our numbers are still dramatically low in the seats of authority where influence matters and where it makes a difference. And those are the kinds of things that we have to be talking about, because there's still too many rooms you walk into, you're the only woman. There's still too many rooms where we're not represented at all. There's still too many companies that you're probably invested in that have no women at all on their boards. Those are the things you need to be fighting for.
And I think that's the point. Is it's great. We were talking about this kind of out in the hall before we came in here. Is one of the side effects of all of this is that people are starting to look. We were talking about the Fearless Girl statue, and the article came out that they're about to move it. And one of the notes they made was, out of the 400 companies they kind of were looking at, 150 were really their focus. At this point, every single one of those 150 has at least a woman on the board of directors. That's not where we want to be, but it did have an impact. It was the packaging that caused attention, which caused people to make change. And you said this morning you saw something funny on TV, and we were saying that sometimes those things that are funny and lighthearted are calling attention to something that then has impact.
Yeah, if you guys saw the New York, I think it was this morning's New York Times, there are just as many women in the Fortune 500 as CEOs as there are men named John. Yeah. I mean, that's one of those staggering things when you hear it. And it was, I looked at it, and the first thing was, and it was disgrace and then a little bit of laughter. And but the point is, I think that you're trying to make is this is drawing attention, and if we can continue to draw attention so that it at some point will become numb to it, won't be a new thing. It'll just be the way things are, which is women feeling empowered to be able to sit in positions of leadership and be able to be assertive about, you know, what rights they have, what expectations, and that expectation should be to be able to sit around the table with the men.
How important do you think the packaging is? The Fearless Girl statue was a news story. It was cute. People took pictures with it. The guy's named John. You know, I think sometimes you see these things and it's sort of hostile and volatile of being in the street and demanding and yelling and screaming. And then you have these cute ways. Is it that there isn't one packaging? How you guys are at the top. So you've seen things work and not work. What's the way to go with this moving forward so it's not just cute, but then it's not also so aggressive that people are defensive, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
I would just say, I mean, it's the moment, right? It's the moment that you're in now. Take advantage of it. So there's a lot of news and there's cuteness and other things, but at the end of the day, there's a place where everybody's aware. You know, you now have the voice to say, I'm not going to tolerate discrimination or tolerate somebody treating me in a certain way, and that you have the right to ask for what you want. And so I would say take advantage of it, because there's never been a better time than now to speak up and ask for what you want, or speak up and say, no, I'm not okay with this. So I think that's what the Me Too movement, from my perspective, has really given to all of us and to anybody who has an issue, right? It's not actually necessarily a women issue. It is a no tolerance issue across the board.
Would you guys agree with that?
You know, I think besides the fact that this is an opportunity for us to be assertive, and you know, we can be really passionate as well about how we feel and why, and feel empowered by that. But I think there's also a kind of a rational, a reasonable approach that women tend to have about things. And many times I'm thinking back to the Women's March over the last couple of years, and this wasn't a rowdy group of people with, protesting and screaming. This was about friendship and sisterhood and empowerment, and it was a feel-good moment, not a hostile moment. And I think if we can carry those feel-good movements forward, that actually will advance it a lot further. That doesn't mean that we should be, passive, but rather we should just, we can be strong and assertive without being hostile. And so I think that there is, that this movement is giving us an opportunity to package things in ways that don't look like we're, acting out, but rather this is about getting what we deserve.
I agree with what Karen, with what both people said, but I think the other critical piece here is that we have to be relentless about it. I think we have to. It is, and relentless isn't necessarily, as Caralynn just said, hostile. It's about continuing to ask why. Why is this acceptable? And also creating opportunities for women ourselves, which we have done and been very successful at, which is not waiting for people to go, okay, you can come in and sit at the table. I mean, we still need to push for that, but we also need to say, well, while you're waiting to let us in the door, we're going to continue to create opportunities and show you what we can do on our own. So I think it's both, and I think but it is a recognition that we still have a lot of ways to go. And I think more importantly, the broader community is starting to recognize that it's a problem too, which I think is the point of what's happening with Me Too.
I think too, one of the things I see too, and I like this idea of the John and the statue and all these different ways, because I think that's what happens. I spent my life in TV news, and that's what you saw was it was taking the same story and finding different ways to tell it so people don't become tone deaf. It doesn't become that thing you think you've seen before. But what I think is also interesting is this past week, Senator Tammy Duckworth, actually got the rules changed, and babies, which we probably all thought babies were in the Senate anyway, but actual aged babies are allowed on the Senate floor now. And my business partner pointed out that in the comment section, they were like, well, that's great for you, but what are you doing for me? And I thought that's so fascinating because she made a literal change. Now think how long things take to change in the Senate. It would normally take more than 9 months to get a law changed. She didn't plan on making this law 9 months ago. She had a baby. This needed to happen for her to do her job, and she pushed for change, and it happened. I wonder if you think we're taking enough time to acknowledge what the moves that have been made. You know, if we don't notice that the women were put on the boards at the 150 companies, if we don't notice that you guys are sitting in power positions right now, do we also kind of hurt ourselves by constantly wanting more but never recognizing the moves that are being made?
I don't think we're not, I think yes. So I think the short answer is yes, we need to recognize those successes,
dear.
I think. But I also think you need to recognize, something it was said earlier is that the environment change. They've had women who have children in the Senate, not a lot of them, but they have women who have children in the Senate. It's in part because it was the time, right? It was in part because no one wanted to be the guys who went, nah, you can't bring your baby. So I think that's important to recognize as well, that it is to take it. What she did is what we just talked about. She took advantage of the change in time and attitudes and moved the ball forward. And I think we do have to recognize that.
I think all too often, and this is not just a female thing, but I think it often becomes a female thing. It's like, great, we did that, what's next? And we don't take time to go back and to celebrate these kinds of things. And so I hope that maybe this is a time for us to say, well, we've got to keep that dialogue going so we don't become tone deaf, then think about new and exciting stories to be able to share with each other so the stories keep going and we keep motivating more people and giving more people opportunities.
Well, and I think it's a way to keep the movement going so it doesn't become a news cycle. Because amazingly, it's been a year and a half. I mean, we've had a lot of things happen in the last year and a half, and it keeps coming. And I think some people are like, okay, well, what's going to be next? Women have had their moment, now what? And it just keeps going. So do you have hope that we're looking at not a moment or even a movement, but actual change?
Yeah, I mean, it should be the way of life, right? That, actually my hope is that we stop celebrating because everything is fairly fair. Right, it's normal. So that's what I'd like to get there. I know that wasn't your question. But I think, we should acknowledge the things we've accomplished, but we have such a long way to go that, I think it's okay to focus on what's still not done yet. So,
What do you think in the forward movement? Any more thoughts, or we're good? We're good. So let's talk about an aspect of the Me Too movement that comes up, and that's that it's not inclusive, that there are groups of women who don't feel a part of it. And I feel like if we want real change for women, it has to be for all women, and all women have to be moving together in a direction. So how do you face that? How do you bring that up? How do you kind of unite people? I imagine getting to the positions you're in, you've had to do it without it being a clear space to do. You were women that moved through male-dominated fields to these positions. So how do you find that compromise to bring everybody together if you have women of color not feeling like they're part of a movement, or people who are part of the movement not understanding why people don't feel part of the movement? So how do we address that before moving forward so nobody's left behind?
one of the things I did this is kind of maybe a tangential answer, but one of the things I did with my leadership team with the Me Too movement was to bring our employee relations and our legal and our HR to really just have a very open dialogue, because sadly, most of my leadership team are white men. And I wanted to have the conversation with them in front of them about what all of this meant to them as well, and have them be able to ask the questions in a safe space about, do they behave differently with women now? And it was a really great dialogue, sort of opened up, like, why are we having the dialogue? And I sort of shared with them my own experiences that I don't think that they had sort of understood, sort of all the micro things that have happened along the way. They're just small little things, right? But they add up. So I kind of shared that, and I teed it up with them. And then we had our HR and employee relations team did a really nice job of saying, listen, it's like you can still talk to women, and you can still go to lunch with them. And, when we do a lot of investigations, right, because we are very much about, if you see something or you're uncomfortable, you have to raise your hand. It's a no tolerance kind of place. So we get a lot of calls. But it's never a he said, she said kind of thing. It very rarely is that. And usually there's a pattern, and usually there's much more. So I think it gave all of the men a lot more comfort that somehow this wasn't going to completely change how they had to interact with women. So for me, that was about being inclusive of them as well, so that we could sort of, as a team, deal with the issue and have everybody sort of uniformly understand it in the same way, at least in the context of our business. So that's my view on it. I don't know if you guys.
I think what I would add to this, I think it's really about recognizing that people's perspective is a little different, driven by where they're coming from. So whether it's white men or men, not just white men, but men who are feeling like, uh-oh, can I say hello? Can I continue to build the relationships in the way I'm used to building it, or do I have to be uncomfortable? And a lot of men are now uncomfortable. So having that conversation, or whether it's recognizing that women of color have additional barriers to their gender that impact their circumstances, and so or may impact their feeling of power and their ability to respond. And so I think it is really important that when we think about I don't think it's so much that women of color don't think they're in the included. I think it's that they think it's not all inclusive. It's like when Lean In came out. I think women of color could certainly adjust to it, but there's a whole nother level, actually, that Sheryl Sandberg herself recognized existed, and then subsequently addressed in a subsequent piece. But the point is, there's more to it, and we all need to keep that perspective in mind. It's not everybody's coming to it from the same place.
I think I'll just add, I think what both of you said was exactly right, and I think both of you highlighted something around intentionality, that it actually takes some purposefulness and being able to make sure that you are being inclusive, because it's not always easy, and it's sometimes not always natural, whether that means inclusive of women of color or men or the various groups. That it's not just one group of women that it's being affected by this, but wearing that intentionality and purposefulness is part of this, if it means bringing together your teams or for other types of activities. I think that's an important piece of this.
What are you seeing the ramifications? Because the Me Too, criminality of Me Too started last September, October. And I think we've gone to Time's Up, Let's Make Change, to inclusion riders in Hollywood starting to be applied across the board in businesses. Like that if I'm going to work with you, I want you to be inclusive, that it starts to become something we demand. So in your businesses, that's what's on the newspaper, that's what's on TV, that's what's on Facebook and social. But in the actual workplace, what has the ramification been of all of this attention? Have you seen a ramification? Obviously you have, because you had a meeting and you addressed it. Are you seeing just the talking, or are you seeing things changing in perspectives or eyes opening, or are we still in the baby phase?
For us, I think we've been, before the Me Too movement started, at least with gender, we were very sort of progressive about it. So this has been a journey for us. So I don't know that I necessarily saw anything significantly change outside of just making sure that everybody felt they understood sort of what the boundaries were, or that things didn't really change in terms of how you need to interact with women. So I was just trying to deal with that issue. But I don't know that a lot necessarily has changed. It's just that I think people feel differently, feel like they have a voice maybe more than they had before. And I think that's a really great thing. A voice to ask for what you want, a voice to speak up if you feel like you are not being treated fairly in some way, shape, or form.
And I think that's, I agree. It's not just about Me Too. It's not necessarily there's been this dramatic change, but there's actually been, obviously, a number of changes within our country over the last year and a half or so. And so I think there is an appreciation and an attention around diversity that is new, or it's a greater attention on that. And so, so at UI Labs, we're all about collaboration. It's all about bringing diverse groups together across different stakeholders in our community, from big companies and small companies and startups and innovators from universities and government. And sometimes, I think people are surprised, and it's from like, well, that's why you're all here, but they're surprised about how much they learn from each other. We hear some of our large, aerospace and defense companies saying, I didn't imagine how much I was going to learn from that, food and beverage company or that consumer packaged good company. And while it's obviously a different type of diversity, I think that there is a renewed sense around how much collaboration that brings in diverse groups can actually get the ball farther. I mean, we've heard all the stats for years about how boards that have women and women or men of color on them have greater performance records. And we say that and we hear that, but not all the companies are actually going forward and making those moves. But I think that the increased attention over the last year and a half is making a difference. And it's not just about Me Too. It's generally the various things going on that are causing people to realize that diversity of thought is actually important. And of course, there's been the antithesis to that, where we also have a number of different groups, I think, that very sadly and very unfortunately are shying away even further from that diversity of thought, which is really a shame. But it's something here at UI Labs that we celebrate. And so I'm excited that this movement will continue.
I think the only thing I would add is that I think there's not so much a sea change, but a broader awareness and sensitivity that it is coming out in different ways, and people are being more conscious of. We still, I think, have much work to do. So I think the way I would say it is, I walk into a room, I'm the only woman or person of color, I am immediately aware of it, always. Lots of my friends and colleagues, that they don't have that same experience, right? They walk into the room, they're like, okay, this room I'm kind of used to, and I think that's changed. I think there's more of a, wow, everybody in this room looks exactly like me, and that's not a great thing for my organization. That awareness is changing. But Caralynn touched on it before, I think the idea of intentionality is critical. There's a great National Geographic that came out earlier this year on race, and they have a whole host of articles, and there's an article in there that I think is particularly profound about us and them, like how we pick our teams and how our level of comfort with us versus them, regardless of what it is, whether it's Hutsi and Tutu and Tutsi and Rwanda or whatever. And I think it's really important to recognize that we have a natural biological inkling to pick a team, our team, the people who are like us. All of us have that. And if the only way we change that is by being intentional about recognizing the benefit of diversity, and also that we have to all have a little hump to get over when people are different, when they're not like us. And I think those things are starting just a little bit to happen.
So one of the things, when I brought up the Fearless Girl statue and that now women are on the board of directors, it's happening in a lot of places, not because of these movements. It's just a natural progression of people fighting to get into those positions. But you have a lot of women stepping into power positions who've never worked for women, never seen a woman CEO. They've never seen a woman who's a managing director. They haven't seen how a woman leads. They've seen how the men lead. And we just did a whole bunch of interviews, and some people were like, well, there is no difference, and some people were like, oh, well, there is a difference. But the fact of the matter is, you have a lot of women who are entering into spaces they've never been before, and now they have to lead. So how do we go about helping women lead as women, not having to try to conform to what they've seen, but their own voices? I know you were talking about Accenture. It's been really great because they noticed that you did things differently, and that was a benefit. But how do we help that apply? Why does it work there? How do you help other people do that and replicate that?
I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, you have to be who you are. And trying to emulate somebody else will never really be effective. And so I think you just got to own it. Like, own who you are, be the best that you can be, and lead with that. And don't try to emulate the guy or the other woman or whoever else, right? It's and feeling comfortable doing that, because you now see leaders that have a variety of different styles versus just one style, will help you have the confidence to do it. But, authentic leadership is the only way to go, because otherwise people will see through it. So I would, own it, be who you are, and lean in with it.
I may be slightly controversial with what I'm going to say because I agree wholly with what you say, but I often have young women who I've had the pleasure of working on our team where they've said, well, how do we figure out who we are as leaders? And I've joked in talking with some of the younger people that it's like fake it till you make it. And it's not that I'm saying to not be authentic, is that as you're maturing in your professional careers, you need to look to role models, and again, men or women, and be able to emulate characteristics about them, I think, that impress you, that you feel are effective, that you think, that's consistent with my values and something that I think makes sense for me as a leader, me as I'm growing in my career. And so I think, to your point around women on boards and women in leadership positions, I think this it creates a breadth of people, men and women, who now our young women leaders can look up to and begin to use as role models to then create their authentic self. So I wholeheartedly agree with that, but I do think that we're blessed now being able to have more of those people to look to.
I think I just want to really echo that because I think that's the point. I think it is everybody, I was a trial lawyer, you're a trial lawyer, you copy, the thing you do most is copy other people's stuff, especially when it's really good. But you have to copy their stuff that's authentic to you, right? So there's a guy used to work for me that he liked to throw stuff in the courtroom. It was not, in my view, particularly effective, but it worked for him, apparently. Like, I'm not a throw stuff in the courtroom kind of girl, right? It's just not going to work for me. So, but the bigger issue, I think, for a lot of us is you look up. It used to be looked up, and there was nobody there. So not only are you not trying to figure out what part of that not throwing the chair across the room part, but what also could I take? It's harder to do when there's nothing about the role model that relates to you can do it, but it's harder. Now at least you have some role models, and there'll be people who look like you by gender, but who have totally different styles, right? There are a lot of people who lead very differently, women who lead very differently from me, who are incredibly effective leaders. So I think it does give you a broader pool of leadership to pick from, right? And that's the benefit, right? You have a wider range to go, oh, well, that's interesting. I haven't seen that before, as opposed to kind of a more narrower pool.
I was interviewing Genevieve Tears, who, if you don't know her, she started Sitter City, and then it was huge. But at first, it was her fighting to get her babysitter business funded in the male world. But as it moved on, it equaled out. And she was telling me she hired this guy to come in, and he was in one of the executive offices, and he's there, and on day 2, she walks up and he's got an assistant. And she's like, an assistant? Like, she's like, I didn't have an assistant. And she's like, I'd never even thought of having an assistant. I would have thought it made me look like I didn't know what I was doing to have this assistant. But this guy on day 2 has an assistant outside. And she's like, that's how the guy thinks. I need this assistant, so I do more. Whereas she was always thinking, what's the perception of it? And, oh, I should save that money. And I think, so it's not all just about women being different, but she didn't know. Like, she'd never seen a woman with an assistant. The women had been the assistants, but she had never seen a woman who was a leader who had one. So are there things like that you discovered, that just it was her own thing. It was her own perspective. She said the same thing about delivering bad news. She's like, the best advice I have is, as a boss, go in, drop it, and get out. She's like, don't ask them for drinks. Don't go try to get coffee. Just go in, drop it, and leave. And she's like, it went against all my instincts to do. So whereas you were talking about, as a female, you offer different things and bring different things to the table, and that your company recognizes that and rewards that. Are there things that just, as a woman, you've approached differently and that you learn? Does that make sense?
This immediately reminds me of a study that was a few years ago. I think that Deloitte put out, and it was about women leaders, and it was actually specifically in kind of manager level leaders. And I may not get all the stats exactly right, but it was basically saying that women and men begin earlier in their careers progressing around the same path in many professions. But then there's a divergence that happens around the manager level, and what happens is the men learn how to delegate, and the women believe that the only way to prove myself is for me to do it all. And so what happens is the men continue to rise and manage more people and gather more assistants, and the women keep overloading their own plates, so they're just totally burning themselves out. And I think, and that's a story again that I share with a lot of the women that work here, because I know for me as a growing leader, I definitely saw that self in me. I still see it. When I have men on my executive team, and I'm thinking, well, I can do that. I don't need them. And then I have to realize, no, actually, my job is to delegate that, and my job is not to do that. And I think that we try to be super women and. Or superwoman, if you will, and I think sometimes we actually need to remind ourselves that to grow as leaders, it means not necessarily doing it all, but knowing what are the right questions to ask, or who to delegate to, or when I need an assistant or more than one assistant. But that's not a natural tendency for us. And so I love the story that Genevieve shared. I think it's very relatable.
And I think that's the point, because I think a lot of people, it comes down to, can women do this or men do this? But I don't think I'm really talking about the personality or the grit or the integrity. I'm talking about, like we were just talking, the hands-onness, like knowing that you do certain things a certain way, or that you can have an assistant. Like, I would imagine those women that stayed manager, like, I'm staying a manager because I'm a woman and they're a man and they're just promoting them. Whereas if somebody had walked in and said, well, yeah, but you only get things half done, and he gets them all done, and she says, well, he's got assistants, and they say, well, why don't you? Yeah. Like, I those are like actual learned things. It's not something that you just you grit your way through. So I think that's really interesting, but it comes from the fact that if you haven't seen a woman with an assistant, you don't know you can have one. And they say that with going in for raises, the common story, that women are like, well, maybe can I have this, or, can I get this? Whereas men go in and say, hey, I work hard, so you should pay me more. It's an approach thing. Do you see that impacting how women try to get in that room that they haven't been in before?
I think that being an advocate for yourself is because we're like 5 levels in, right? We're like, I deserve it, but what about this? And we've got the buts down, right? We're like, I'm really good at this, but I'm not so good at this, and I think that's just how we broadly think about things, and that's a huge, and also that comfort level. I was very hard for me to be a self-advocate, right? I can advocate for others, I can advocate for a cause, advocate when I was running, I ran a not-for-profit, had no problem stalking people for money, none. I could, I could catch you anywhere and ask you for money for my organization. Running for office, asking you for money for me, made me grossly uncomfortable, because it was about me. And I think understanding, getting that comfort level with self-advocating is critical, because I think men generally are naturally more comfortable with it. Not every man, but I think as a generalization, they're just naturally more comfortable in it than your average woman.
I got some great advice on this topic I was sharing with you earlier, which is you have to, again, find out what's comfortable for you. We all feel a little uncomfortable advocating for ourselves. Somebody said to me early in my career, everybody likes to give advice. And so you can use with your boss, hey, I'd like to get some advice from you. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? It feels very comfortable. You can still get your message across. The advice could be, I'd really like to get to the next level, whatever it is that you're striving to achieve. But you have the conversation in the context of getting advice. It felt much more comfortable and akin to my own personality, but the outcome was the same because I was able to, that person's giving me advice, so I'm not asking them or I'm telling them they need to do something. They're now in the boat with me. They've mapped out the plan with me. They say, okay, if you do these things, you're gonna get there. So again, find the ways to express and ask and advocate for yourself that feel like it's who you are and feels comfortable, but you can get it done multiple ways.
Last year at this conference, one of the founders was telling a story about how she approached an investor, and she was like, oh, will you look at my deck? Will you help me with this? And she's like, I wanted his money, but I didn't just want to ask him for the money. And so she was giving advice. If you want to try to get money, try to ask them to lunch and ask them to look at your deck and talk about it and what can improve, and they'll fall in love with what you're doing and see what you're doing. And it's funny because I think she was giving that a tip for someone seeking funding, but in reality, I think it's how she felt most comfortable, because she didn't want to sit down with them and say, here's my great idea, here's how it works, give me money. That didn't feel naturally. So it was interesting because she went with it, but it was exactly what you're saying. This is where I want to get. What do you think about how I get there? And in him helping her, he fell in love with what she was doing and ended up helping her. So I think that's an actionable way to approach it. What about Andy or Caralynn? Any other actionable ways to overcome this? Because it's a huge issue. I mean, going in for raises, going in for money, going for positions. We hear it again and again that women don't recognize, or at least they're not saying it. So how do we work against our nature to overcome that natural kind of issue?
I think we're at a really good time in history, if you will, for this. And I'm actually referring to all the data that's out there today and all the data that we have access to. So I don't know about you guys, but for me, my big thing is I want to feel very informed. Like I know the answer before I go in with it. And I think that's, again, something that tends to be what women are looking for versus men. And so I rely on data over instinct probably more than I should. But we have a lot of data out there. And so when it comes to things like asking for raises, for example, I will tell you that when I get that asked from my team, it's usually common with, and these are the comparables that I have found on Googling every different way of looking at my position. And actually we, in our people and culture team, we've actually changed to data-driven compensation. So we have this service where you have thousands of data points. And so it becomes very empowering for us as employers, but also I think it becomes empowering for the team. But I love your example of asking the question about how do you help me with this? I think another way to do that, that one doesn't work. There's also, try to do what you can to be able to gather the data that helps support your decision. I think it'll just make you naturally feel more confident then and feel like you've got that endorsement going in to be able to make those kinds of asks.
I think those are, the two great, really, really good ideas. I think the only thing really I can add to that is also recognizing that you don't have to have 100% of the answer, right? That people get promoted into stretch jobs, people get promoted into other opportunities. My daughter is a recent college grad, 3 years out, and trying to figure out what she wants to do. And so, of course, like the psychotic type A mother that I am, I'm always sending her job ideas. I'm like, look, you could do this, and you would be fabulous at this. And she often says to me, she'll look at a job description, she'll be like, well, Mom, I can't do all of the things, right, on the job description. Like, I only do like half of them. What job description ever in time did everybody always do, right? But we're like, I can only do some of those. We're like, great, well, you'll knock those out of the park, and that'll be great, and you'll learn the others. But that's recognizing that you don't have to cover every single thing that you're advocating for, that you can do some of those things really well, and you'll learn the rest, and making that argument for yourself. You don't have to cross every single T to move forward.
It's actually one of the things we're doing at Accenture is looking at all of our job descriptions, recognizing that exact point, because we were like, we're not getting the same number of women applying for our jobs as men, or not the requisite number. So going back and simplifying those job descriptions just so that we don't sort of naturally make our pool smaller just because our job descriptions are so complicated. So it's actually been a very intentional thing we've been going through, because we hire a lot of people.
I always remember the story of a woman who was in a managing position at Red Eye, and it was time for raises, and the bosses said she could give 20% raises to anybody on her team. And so she was like, okay, I'm going to give 20% because it's her budget. She's like, I'll give 20% to anyone who comes in and asks for a raise. She said not a single woman made mention of a raise, insinuated a raise, but half the men did. Came in expecting in the review and made mention of getting more money. And I just thought that was an interesting thing of the ask. And it's something that recurs in the interviews a lot, is that women don't think they deserve it. Or even if they think they deserve it, they think it's so obvious they deserve it, someone's just going to hand it to them. And I mean, I think I feel that way sometimes. Like, I did an amazing job. Like, I'm an amazing interviewer up here. You guys should be recognizing this. I should be getting cookies at the end of this or something. Like, I think that's something I relate to a lot, is that I feel like if I say, hey guys, am I doing a good job? And you clap, it doesn't mean anything. But if you do it and I didn't ask for it, it means more. And so once again, it keeps coming back to those things that society has put us in this box, and that's what we've been trained to do. So as women of power, how do you overcome that? I'm sure, and I may be making an assumption, that overcome that need to be like, well, I want to have a pretty dress and look good and be nice and thought of, all the ways women want to be thought of, but at the same time, you're in a power position. Did you have to let that go, or do you still battle with it in each of your jobs? Or maybe you don't battle with it at all, you're just good with being badass and that's it.
For me, I would say I think I'll use your word, which is intentional. So it was always intentional, but trying to find a way to do it in a way that felt comfortable to me. So there's a couple of techniques that I used. One was early in my career, I would say I'd go to my, I'd change bosses and move bosses. In consulting, you change your bosses a lot. So the next project I would go to, I'd sit down with my manager or whoever my lead was and say, last year was rated, exceeds. So my expectation is that that's the rating I'm going to get this year. And if you see me performing in a way that's not consistent with that, will you let me know? And I just did it once at the very beginning, and it was strategic because either that person is going to give you feedback along the way, or if they haven't, at the end of the year, they're going to remember that conversation and be like, crap, I didn't give her that feedback. Now I owe her that. I'm like, I'll take it either way.
In number 3, you reminded him that you exceed.
Right.
So you've also tooted your own horn without.
With that, you set a mindset about, that person is a high performer. So you set that expectation, and then you kind of, go along with it. So I think it worked for me.
That's great.
Obviously, yes. What about you, Carolyn?
I've gotten 2 great suggestions. I'm like, oh my God, I should be taking notes. So I think the other thing is to recognize that, so I have some traits that in general I feel pretty good about. I'm pretty direct. I think that's great. It helps solve issues. But some people are not always really comfortable with it. And so I think recognizing and trying to get a read from people about what works for them, not having also be about you, really is also can be helpful as well. Although you have to recognize that sometimes people aren't really honest about it. Every CEO I've ever worked with says, I really like people who are direct and honest. I don't want a bunch of yes people around me. They're lying. Nobody likes to be, criticized. So, but then you have to manage how you do it. But I think that idea of laying having that conversation with your leader, your boss, or whoever is going to be evaluating around what their expectations are, what does success look like for them, what do they like, at least you'll have some idea of the playing field.
Yeah, and if they can't articulate it, that's also a problem, right?
Exactly.
So,
At least you know.
Yeah, I've progressed in my career. It's harder as you get higher up. Your success factor is a little bit more nebulous, right? It's not always as clear cut. And so I now have the discussion a little bit like, at the end of the year, what would you need to see for you to say she hit it out of the ballpark? Mm-hmm. And
that's an interesting
and
approach.
It's always hard for them to answer that. But you get a few nuggets, and then I'll hear that and I'll think about it. I'll go back and I said, well, I heard what you said. This is my approach to hitting it out of the ballpark. Do you agree or don't you agree? But it takes time and it's hard.
But it's also communication.
It is
It's making sure that they aren't thinking, well, to hit it out of the park, she's going to invent a rocket that takes me to Mars, and you had no idea that was an option.
Right.
It's setting you clearly, but them too, that at the end they don't dream up something you never even knew was a thought. Carolyn, what about
Well,
you?
I just, kind of flipping that on the other side, that's actually one of the questions when I sit down with my team every year is I ask them, what do you think success looks like for the year? And I want them to be able to share that with me for exactly the reason that you mentioned. That I like them to be in charge of their own destiny. I mean, I'll tell them if I think they should add something to it or that's not part of their job. But I think that we all have to be our own advocates. And, whether that means asking for a raise or asking for clear expectations around what success looks like, or putting a statement out there about these are my expectations or this is what I think success looks like. I think there's both directions that are important to take. And I think I can think of several points in my career where if I wouldn't have asked if it was possible, it never would have happened. And so you just have to remember, sometimes it's just asking the question. You're never going to get something you don't ask for, or rarely. Your round of applause may not. but when you ask for it, it certainly people begin to think about it. And so, is, again, something we tell everyone here is that you've got to be your own advocate. We're going to do our best to advocate for you, but we also need to know what you want, and we need you to be able to assert that as well.
One of the things I've seen is flipping this whole idea on its head, and I've seen more push, and a lot of people in here are founding companies. They're going to be bosses. They are bosses. They're hoping to have these future teams, or are going to have these future teams. I've seen this trend where it's been written in several articles about bosses starting to say, this is the kind of boss I want to be. Great, like giving your viewpoint of me as a boss from your seat. And I know that's dangerous and hard, but I think it's also kind of enlightening because it works both ways. That the perception of a boss thinking they're being clear and then you're failing, it's making sure that you're understanding as a boss how to do it. So with you guys, what are you trying to be as a boss? What kind of boss are you trying to be? And where do you think you fall on that? It's okay. Remember, you're allowed to say all the things and boast about yourself as women. You don't have to be shy. I mean, what do you think you do the best as a boss? Where do you think you really shine? Andy, since you're so direct and you know exactly.
No, I'm still, I'm still stuck on something Kara said, but I'll answer your question. But it's that word expectations. I think is really, really, really important, and we don't do it enough to say what we expect both of ourselves and of others. And so I really was literally sitting here thinking, like, God, have I done that? So I'm sorry, I got distracted about what kind of boss I actually am. So I think the main thing that for me is what I'm trying to do is create a world where people understand what's expected and feel that they can deliver it. And they can deliver it recognizing that every now and then they're going to stumble, right, if they're pushing themselves, and that's okay. What I've tried to say to my teams is that as long as I know what you're doing, and we're aligned, I'm good with it, right? May not work out the way we wanted, that's okay, as long as we're aligned. What's harder is to get people to let you know what they're trying to do, but also to just let them go and do it. And I'm generally comfortable with that in the perfect world, what you want as a boss is to be able to sit back, put your feet up on the desk, and know that there's a bunch of people doing stuff that you get to take credit for. I mean, it's kind of perfect. But it's harder to do that. And it's harder to really create an environment where people feel okay making mistakes.
I was laughing and kind of reflecting on your question because it's, I can think about the boss that I want to be, and then I can, if anyone from my team was here, or then there's the boss that I am.
My team's back there is going.
It's actually, I'm involved in a group with fellow CEOs where we get a chance to, share different challenges that we're going through. And it's the best thing because being a CEO is actually a very lonely thing. And if you think your boss has got it together and has got all the answers right, chances are they know they don't have it together and have all the answers. And I think that's just a normal thing. But I think, what Andy said is exactly right. I mean, the best people that I've had a chance to manage is when we both know what the person have the same expectations around what is that person going to accomplish, and that if things are falling short, that's okay. I just want to know about it. So let me know. Don't let me be surprised. That's always something I try to share with the folks I'm working with. But then it is trying to get out of their way. I know that that's one of my challenges. That especially of a young organization, and you want things to go right. You kind of get in the way sometimes. But I think in a perfect world, I think that you do have a situation where You've got someone who relentlessly wants to succeed and to get their job done, and that your job as a boss is just to empower that and let that happen. And to be able to be there for a resource and to be able to be there to give cover. That's another thing that I think I'd like to think that I do well with my team, is give them the cover they need to go do their jobs really well. And at the end of that, if that happens, then we all succeed. And yeah, we all get some credit.
Yeah, I would say the things I strive for. It's interesting to when you lead a group of leaders. I think my own leadership style has evolved over a long period of time. So you have, I have great leaders, but they're running their own large-size businesses themselves. So I think to what you said is not getting in their way. What I have done over my lifetime or my career is to make sure I don't do the things that people did to me that I really hated. So I really focus on that a lot. So for me, things that are really important: clarity, so communicating a lot, consistency. So I try not to be that boss that's like says one thing one day and then says another, because how many of us have had that, right? And that's the worst ever. So try to be really consistent, really clear, and then provide an opportunity for everybody to be equally successful. So that I feel very strongly about. And I had somebody come up to me the other day, and I just finished one of our leadership team meetings, and he came to me and said, what you did today was really impactful to me. And I said, what did I do? I didn't remember what I did. So I was like, let me know so I can do it again. And he said, all you did was, when I made a point, you gave it some validation and you acknowledged it. And it really struck me. And when I go back to the statement that I made before about creating an environment where everybody can be equally successful, it is about being intentional about how you bring out the best in everybody that you have. And that means something different for each individual. And I work really hard to understand each individual and adjust my own style to give them what they need. Because the one-size-fits-all approach actually doesn't work either. And there are people that need a push. And then there are people that need really positive feedback. And then there are people that need the constructive feedback. And you have to take the time to understand what each sort of person really needs to bring the best out of them. Because fundamentally, I'm lazy and I don't really want to do their work. So it is in my best interest to figure out how to have them be the best performer they can be.
Last year I had gone to South by Southwest in Austin, and it's a gathering, it's a convention, so tons of people. So you're meeting all these people, networking, and everybody is lit up, excited, with that power of invention. And I thought, I need to do this networking thing. And so I came back to Chicago, and the first thing that I came across was this Midwest Women in Tech convention. So I came here, and I was like, wow, it was in a big building. It was incredible. It was all day. I met all these people, and it's been a year. And so it's kind of interesting that in a year, I've gone from sitting in the audience to sitting on a panel, interviewing 3 titans of Chicago industry. What role does networking play for you as you are moving up? I'm sure in your positions now it is hanging out with other CEOs and learning from them, but what role did networking have in getting you to the position you wanted to be here? And kind of talk about, I'd like you to each give a piece of advice on networking, because I think there are pros and cons to it. So what role did it play, and what's your best advice for a networking approach?
There's a piece of advice I give folks often, so I'll share that, and then I'll explain my experience. The first thing is, when you go to a networking event, go by yourself, which might sound counterintuitive, but I found that you go to a networking event with a buddy, and all you do is talk to your buddy, and because it's not natural. So I come out of the medical research world, and I didn't have a business card before I was, 26 or 27. It was a very unnatural thing for me to do, to go and talk to someone that I hadn't met and try to figure out if there's any relationship that we were to have with one another. And I found that I met the least number of people when I went to events with people. And so that's my piece of advice. But in terms of what networking has meant for me, and you're right, I think it's gotten more and more important actually as my career's gone on. And I think that's just the nature of being in senior positions. Our job is to be very external facing. And so therefore there's a lot of networking. It's different. It's usually not with strangers. Well, maybe people I don't know, but I know why I'm meeting them. But oftentimes young in your career, you'll walk into a room where you don't know anyone and you're just trying to figure it out. But I think that being open to what types of connections might happen, networking is what has led me to virtually, I was going to say virtually every job, but I think I can remove virtually and say every job I've had. I've actually never taken a job that I've applied for except for a semi-government role that actually I needed to officially apply for in order to get it. But it's because of networking, and it's because of meeting people and establishing relationships. And you all know this, but networking to get a job is one of the most important things. So at least I'll tell you, I look at the resumes when someone emails me and says, will you please go look at this person's resume? And it's not because I don't think all the other resumes are not important. It's because there's only so many hours in a day, and I'm going to trust someone's referral. And that's going to only happen if you're going out and networking.
I think thinking about it in terms of relationship building, I mean, that's really what it is. It's about connecting and building that kind of relationship. And oftentimes with networking, you don't know when you're doing it. Could be years, could be months before something happens that's relevant. And also, you often don't see it coming, right? You don't see the benefit of that networking coming right away. So I think fervently, no one here got where we are because by ourselves. Contrary to, I don't know if anybody, I talk about this all the time because I thought it was so funny when Allison Janney accepted her Academy Award this year. She got on the stage and she said, I did this by myself. And then went into her speech. And I think we all laugh because we know that that's impossible. And so networking is just one other aspect of that that I think is just critically important because you just never know, especially for entrepreneurs, right? Because you just don't have a feel yet for or know what the rest of the potential is out there for who could help you. So you just have to make yourself do it.
So what's your networking tip?
My main networking tip is to not necessarily think you have to have a resolution today. Some people, when you're networking, everybody's like, okay, I gotta figure this out. And is to stay connected with people, but don't worry about, is it today or is it 6 months from now or is it a couple of years from now? Because I've connected with people multiple years down the line. And the other piece I would say is also remember that people remember not necessarily what you said or what you did, but they remember how you treated them. So even if you don't particularly like the person when you meet them networking, don't wear that on your face, right? And because how you treat people matters, and they'll remember that.
And the one tip I would say is it's sometimes easier if you go early. I know our natural inclination is to go later because it feels uncomfortable, but go early because then you start to meet people and then you can host people. It's an easier way to get to know people. Personally, I've hated it. I hated it in my earlier in my career. I don't really love it now. I do it. But the thing that has made it tolerable for me, I think, is one of you said it, which is that you don't have to have a purpose. If you're really just there to get to know people, and I do just like talking to people, and if it's not about trying to pitch something and putting that pressure on yourself that you got to get your message or your elevator pitch and all that stuff that goes on in your brain, and just say, I just want to get to know people, then it makes it an easier conversation. It's the first time you meet somebody, or they're not going to buy from you or give you a job. It is a relationship over time, and so if you view it that way, I think it's easier, and it's okay to not love it. And lots of people don't love it, so know that there's probably 50% of the people there feeling exactly the way you are.
Yeah, let me just add to that actually, because it surprises me how often I come across CEOs that refer to themselves as introverted, and I'll tell you, I am, and like I find myself, it's energy depleting when I go to big events, but I have to do it. Obviously, it's part of my job, and I think I'm relatively good at it, or I probably wouldn't be in my job. But it's one of those things that, if for those of you who might be out there thinking like, oh my God, is my startup ever going to succeed? Am I ever going to get that next thing? Because I'm not an extrovert personality. I'll tell you, it just surprises me all the time how many CEOs are introverted people by nature.
I would say the same thing. I mean, I worked in TV news. I had to interview people on the street, and it was my job. And so I think most people who know me would be shocked that I am a complete introvert. I could go a whole weekend and never see another human and be kind of happy. I just happen to be good at being extroverted. And so I think what that calls into play is realizing that while you walk in a room and everybody seems like they're all there are tons of people who hate being there. One of the best things about Facebook is things pop up now, and it's like, I don't want to go because I don't want to. Like, I'm not coming because I don't want to. And you've seen all these introverted like t-shirts and things pop up, and I'm like, oh my God, there's so many other people who don't want to go someplace and go anyway. I think it's just realizing not everybody in the room is loving every moment of it. And I have to go with the going early is good, because the other people are by themselves, and then you meet, and by then you've formed a club. So then everybody comes in and they're like, what's this in crowd with these 5 people over here? I got to get in on that. It's just a perception thing. I think we have Q&A down, and I know when I'm at these things, sometimes they have questions, but if you don't have questions, we can keep talking. But does anybody have a question? I know that's asking. Yes.
Hi. So thank you so much for sharing everything. Can you speak about the mentors you've had? So I feel a little bit differently because most of my mentors have always been males that have come into the field, and I'm in, like banking and technology, which is heavily white, male dominated, older. So I started in my career like literally at 16. I've been in this field working my way up, and I've been very successful. But unfortunately, the feedback I've gotten from women has always been negative, as it's almost like they don't want you to advance, they want to keep you where you're at, so that you're not better than that. And the people that I've benefited the most have been males. Can you speak to that?
So her question was saying that in the mentors she's had, many of the men she feels have been very supportive, whereas she felt like a lot of the women felt like they didn't want to see her rise. That's the perception she has, that they didn't want to see her rise. And so she wanted to know about the mentors you've had. And also from that perspective, as women mentors now, do you see that or feel that, or do you think it's a miscommunication?
I think you just haven't connected with the right women. I mean, there's some amazing women mentors, but I've had both, and I think the men, women, different races. So I think the important point is connecting with people who want to engage, want to engage with you on the issues that are important to you. So I wouldn't give up on women mentors yet. I think you just haven't crossed the right path. For me, it's really been about getting people to invest in you and being willing to ask questions and not being afraid to ask questions and ask for help. And generally, I think as was said earlier, people want to help. Most people, not all, but most. And so I think you'll find those people, and the key is it sounds like you already are, is to be open to it and to be willing to approach people who you think might be able to help you and ask them for it.
And I don't think it's about not having male mentors. I think it's great to have male mentors. Many of the women I know they're at because of the male mentorship. So I think it's really positive to have male mentors. And I think sometimes now with all the stuff we've been talking about, that's caused some confusion of people wanting to stand up to do it. But I agree with her. I mean, when you get in a room full of women, that's what WTF is all about. You get in a room full of women and suddenly you're like, oh, okay.
I think it's about lifting each other up too. It's a kind of a pay it forward thing. Actually, it's one of my male mentors that actually said to me, like, I'm going to invest in you, but the expectation is that you're going to go ahead and pay this forward. And I've never forgotten that. And so I love mentoring men and women, but I think that as you look for mentors, and I think that you are right to look for both men and women. I think that a mentor relationship can take many different forms. A mentor relationship could be you go for coffee once or twice and maybe that's it. A mentor relationship can be something, someone that you're meeting with every month, and it can take lots of different forms, and it doesn't have to be formal. You don't have to say like, will you be my mentor? Most of my mentors probably don't know that I think of them as mentors, and that's okay. And hopefully they'll also be flattered if they did know that. But I think that making sure that you develop some continuity in relationships and find those people who can invest in you over time are valuable. I'll give one piece of advice related to that too, that someone had told me I'd given them this piece of advice and it was very valuable. So now I remember to try to give it to everyone, which is, I say just looking for mentors at multiple stages of their career. So I think of this as finding a mentor, someone like just 3 or 4 years ahead of you in their career, or not totally different generation, because I think you can learn a lot from those individuals just as much and maybe more than sometimes looking for a mentor that's maybe 15, 20 years older than you. So mentor doesn't have to be gray hair. Mentor can take on a lot of different forms. And one of my mentors recently suggested that I do some reverse mentoring, meaning looking for people that are younger than me in my team or within the community who can actually kind of teach you things about what younger generations are doing. So you might even think about some reverse mentoring.
Yeah, I mean, I've had equal number of men and women, so I haven't necessarily seen a distinction. I think it is about the connection that you have with the individual. In fact, I would sometimes chose men intentionally to help them in their journey and understanding what I was going through, particularly when I was a new mom. So I was intentional about that, just kind of for the fun of it. But the one thing I would say is, at least in the way we think about mentors, I think there's a difference between mentors and sponsors. And mentors are people that give you advice and coach you and all that sort of stuff. And then there are sponsors who are saying, I pick you and I'm going to pull you up. And I think they are two different roles and they're two different people. Maybe that's what you're alluding to, and the ones that are just 4 or 5 years ahead versus maybe the ones that are older. And it's typically somebody that is 2 levels above you, if you think about it in your organization. That's the kind of person you want. And that one, you can have the dialogue like, will you be my sponsor? And if they say yes, that the sponsor meaning has a real meaning, which is responsibility to really find the opportunities for you to bring you up. So I think about them in these 2 ways.
I heard, now don't tell Genevieve, I'm going to quote her one more time, but she was talking about when she was first in tech, she was the only woman, and then another woman ended up at the table, and what she found, and I thought it was so beautifully said, was when there was a second woman at the table, it amplified her voice, that she would say something, it'd be a good idea, and the woman would also say something, and then it started being heard. Because where it was like sometimes women say things and then men say it and now it's a brilliant idea, they found that actually when the women were amplifying each other. And so I thought it was really interesting because it takes some learning how to be supportive if you've never been supported. If you've been a woman who's never been supported and another woman shows up, you don't exactly know how to show support. And I thought that was such a beautiful way of doing it, that some of the best things we can do is just amplify another woman in the room. And that's a way of like that mentorship of rising someone up is sometimes just helping their ideas be heard. And that can be a mentorship in its own way, or a sponsorship in its own way.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually real research around boards that say that the effectiveness of women on boards isn't really happening unless there's at least three women.
Oh.
So more than 2, right? But 3, when you get 3, then you see the full effect.
Genevieve did say she was sitting in a room full of guys in hoodies, so maybe it only took 2 when they're all in hoodies. So maybe you didn't need all 3.
I mean, I'm sure it was better.
Yeah, right. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name is Shayna Atkins, and I am a founder who runs a consulting business. So this is really for you, Pallavi. But this idea of hiring slow and getting the right talent in very technical roles. So I'm an agile coach, and I hire agile coaches. And the industry is very hot right now, and it's really hard to find really good talent. So what is your advice, and I open it to anyone, but what is your advice on finding the right set of skills, like just enough, but also like developing people as you go? So.
I mean, I'm a big believer in finding the core talent of people who are willing to learn and have the ability to learn, and that you can teach them what you need to teach them. Because Agile may be hot today, right? Something else is going to be hot tomorrow. So you really need to have a workforce that has the ability to know what you're looking for maybe in the short term or has the base capability, but is somebody that can continue to learn. Because particularly in technology, right, it's changing so fast. You have to. So I'd go with the sort of raw talent. And then, as I said earlier, we were looking at our own job descriptions to make sure that we're not Xing people out just because we've written it in such a way that only a certain segment of the population can do it. So I say go with people who you believe will continue to learn.
Yeah, there's actually a fair amount of new research around this idea of adaptability, and that because technology is changing so quickly in this new kind of digital physical convergence that's happening, that we don't know exactly what are those skill sets that are going to be necessary. And so finding people who characterized primarily by that adaptability, I think they need to have, it's an inherent aptitude as well as I think that's going to go a long way for you.
Okay, I think our time is up. I know at the beginning we talked about how many people I had interviewed, and how I always get the good interview is you pick good people to interview.
We had a great interview.
So it also makes everybody think I'm a great interviewer, and really you just really find great people, and then you just say go. So thank you ladies so much. It was truly a Titans panel. Good job.